Hi, good morning. My name is Vice Chair Patrick Bronco for the Water and Land Committee, and this is the start of the Committee on Water and Land Informational Briefing, 8:30 a.m. to receive updates from the Division of Aquatic Resources regarding various programs that you had. The committee is chaired by Chair David Tarnas, but I will be chairing the meeting today. If you folks could take it away, thank you.
Hey, David, I was able to join, so I can kick us off here.
Thank you, Mr. Nielsen.
Perfect. Good morning, Brian Nielsen, Administrator of Division of Aquatic Resources. I would like to thank Chair, Vice Chair, and committee members for hosting this briefing today. We really appreciate the opportunity. We are asked to focus on three main topics today: the Holomoa Marine 30 by 30 initiative, which our DAR planner, Luna Keikoa, will be presenting that portion. Our protected species program and our aquatic biologist, Ryan Jenkinson, will be presenting on that section. And then also our aquatic invasive species program, and Kimberly Fuller and Lizzie Monaghan will be presenting that section. So next slide. So just want to give a brief overview of DAR's Kuleana. So we manage out to 3 miles where the federal jurisdiction takes over. And so this encompasses over 2 million acres of ocean, over 1,400 miles of shoreline, 440,000 miles of stream, and over 400 estuaries. Next slide. We are also co-managers of the Papahanaumokuakea National Marine Monument, along with OHA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA. Next slide, please. So talking about some of the major threats that we're dealing with in the habitats we manage, of course, climate change is our biggest threat and the biggest unknown for the future as well. And this comes in a variety of different forms, from ocean warming, and that's where we've seen multiple coral bleaching events over the last 6 years. We're also facing sea level rise, which contributes to sedimentation and erosion. Changes in storm patterns, where we're seeing more frequent and severe storm events. Changes in precipitation that could come in the form of severe drought or severe flooding. Altered ocean currents, and then also ocean acidification as a result of lowered pH in the ocean. Next slide. And just to get in a little bit more into the specific habitats we manage, and the threats that we face, and that you'll be hearing a little bit more about today in the presentation. So within our stream habitats, we deal with a number of different invasive species, from plants to animals, water quality and quantity, passage barriers that could limit animals from migrating up and down streams, and drought as well. Next slide. We also have our estuaries. These are extremely important habitats for our nearshore fish as nursery grounds. This is where small fish go to hide from predators and capitalize on the abundant food sources in these estuaries. So they're really important nursery grounds for our nearshore fisheries. But these areas also face a lot of issues with invasive species like the Conda mullet in the photo here, the availability of fresh water feeding these habitats, coastal development, and land-based source pollution. Next slide. And also we have our inculine pools, also issues with invasive species, sea level rise, water quality, and coastal development. Next slide. And then our coral reefs that face a whole suite of different pressures, coral bleaching from ocean heat waves, ocean acidification, depleted fisheries, habitat loss, pollution in cesspools, invasive species, marine debris, and carrying capacity. And what I mean by carrying capacity here is, the issues that we're all familiar with visitors congregating in areas that may be beyond the carrying capacity of a marine life conservation district or a sensitive reef habitat, and trying to deal with those impacts, but also manage the issues with those marine animals and marine life that interact with that high concentration of visitors. Next slide. So why is all of this important to manage? Well, economically, there's a number of benefits. Our reefs are valued at $360 million a year to the state's economy, and that's a pretty old estimate and probably a vast underestimate. Nearshore fisheries are valued at $10 to $16 million a year. Local food production has been estimated that our nearshore fisheries provide 7 million meals per year to our Hawaiian families. And shoreline protection has been valued at $835 million a year. So this estimate is the value of our reefs dissipating wave energy before those waves crash on our roads, our homes, our schools, and the value that they provide in protecting our infrastructure. And so next slide. So in addition to the economic value, of course, our nearshore resources are extremely valuable for our culture and way of life. It's what makes Hawaii, Hawaii. And these are all the reasons why we want to manage our resources and really try to see if we can tackle the issues related to climate change, in addition to some of these issues that we've been dealing with for decades, like land-based source pollution and managing fisheries. Next slide. So we had an incredible session last year, thanks to this committee. We had a record number of aquatic related bills passed, but now the work is just starting for DAR as we try to implement these bills. So I'm going to hand it over to David Sakota to go over the status of all of the great work that you guys put in last year and where DAR's at in implementing some of those important bills.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm just going to go in order and highlight some of the different bills that were passed and their status. So the first one is the Commercial Marine Vessel License Bill that was enacted as Act 43. We are currently drafting a comprehensive administrative rules package to amend our licensing and permit rules. And this includes commercial marine vessel license. Act 44 was our crustacean bill that repealed the statute that prohibits the take of female kona crab and other crustaceans. And we are planning to draft rules later this year to implement that so that we can open up the kona crab fishery to take a female kona crab. Act 45 is our laynet permit authority. And we've already drafted rules and we've taken it to the board for approval for public hearing. That was approved in December. And so we will be holding a statewide public hearing for our laynet permit implementation soon. Act 46 is our Ocean Stewardship Special Fund and User Fee Bill. This one takes effect, or the user fee takes effect in 2024. So we're planning for that implementation. We've contracted to develop a implementation plan for that. So just getting all the pieces together for that. Act 47 is our, it's actually a doe care administrative bill to give our enforcement officers additional inspection authority to inspect coolers and places where fish or wildlife can be stored. And so our doe care officers are being trained in that, and we're developing a training, and we're not going to implement this authority in the field until all our officers receive the proper training. Act 48 gave us authority to establish a non-resident recreational marine fishing license. This is also being included in our comprehensive licensing rule package. Act 49 is adaptive management authority to change certain rules such as bag and size limits or season restrictions based on rapidly changing environmental conditions. So we have this tool available. We haven't utilized it yet. It's available to both DAR and DOFA, and I believe DOFA is looking into utilizing this authority possibly for their hunting rules. Act 50 is, this was not an administrative bill, but it's something that the department and DoCare supported to establish special license plates, which would fund enforcement and natural resource management. So DoCare is working on that implementation with the counties. Act 51 also is not an administrative bill, but we supported this. It's a bill to protect sharks, prohibits the intentional take or entangling a shark. And we are also planning to draft rules to implement a permit that would provide for certain non-commercial take of sharks for purposes that would be sustainable and not wasteful. And finally, Act 145 was a repeal of our aquatic life and wildlife advisory committees, which are no longer operational. So that's just a brief update. We have a lot of other rule packages moving forward, including herbivore rules, some community-based subsistence fishing area rules. If you have any questions or want any more information on any of that, feel free to reach out or we'll be available after this. Next slide.
Mahalo, David. And so my name is Luna Kikoa, and I am the community-based subsistence fishing area planner for the Division of Aquatic Resources. And I also get to steer and coordinate the Holomua initiative. And so Brian kind of shared the why. Why is this important, right? There's a lot of money that it's worth, right? Our nearshore resources are very valuable, not only in monetary value, but the cultural connection, right? And so Holomua, Holomua means like, what is Holomua, right? It means progress, it means improvement, right? And so this name was given not only to this initiative, but also for DAR. Like DAR is taking steps. The way we are evaluating our marine managed areas and taking a more holistic approach and including the people, right? The social cultural pieces of management. Being inclusive of community data and utilizing some of that when we're making management decisions and policy making, right? And Holomua also means to improve. So improving the distrust with fishers, improving the relationships with communities, looking at our current regulations and management areas to see if there's things that we need to modify that we can improve. Good example, like we went back and kind of looked at the Kaului Harbor and Maui and revised that managed area. We adjusted the definition of Veke and Oama. And like David said, like the crustacean bills, we're going back and looking at things that we can improve without having to create new things, right? So that's a way that we show our relationship. Hey, we're listening, right? Next slide, please. And so the goal of Holomua, right? What it's about is to effectively manage Hawaii's nearshore waters with 30% established as marine management areas, right? And this is to ensure that our resources will be there for future generations. So like Brian was mentioning, like culturally, like we think in Hawaii, 7 generations, right? You plan for 100 years with Keiki. So that's kind of this culturally thinking, like thinking and planning ahead. And the way we're going to accomplish this is by working with communities, right? So we have marine management tools. We have size limits. So you can only catch the fish after it gets to a certain size to make sure that they're making babies, right? You can only catch a certain amount to make sure that there's enough to do their job out there, right? We call them ecosystem services. And so just these different tools that we have, and then working with the communities, right? We use the word manage. We want to effectively manage. And so as part of this management, it includes the people. It includes us, right? The Kanaka. So not only are we part of the problem, but we're also part of the solution. And this is one of those cultural concepts, like people are part of the ecosystem, right? You look at Hawaiians, like we are connected to the Kumulipo through the coral polyops. Kalo is our older brother, right? So this connection is something that we brought into Holomua. Next slide, please. All right. And so it's not like a 1 or 2 person show. Like this is a team, right? So we have a Holomua team. So it's myself. We have an MMA biologist, Stacia Marcoux. We have Anita Sang, who is our Grau Fellow. We have Diana Locara, who is our 30 by 30 Planning Associate. And we have Kelly Segum, who is our Legal Fellow, right? And so we are the canoe that gets to paddle around to the different islands. So when we paddle to Kauai, we have a team of 5 over there that we can go and work with. When we go to Oahu, there's about 10 folks with their own staff, right? Hawaii Island, there's 5 over on Kona side, 5 over on Hilo. And then the Maui Nui folks, they have about 5 folks in their office. And so our canoe paddles around, right? One of the things is that both Stacia and myself are civil service, right? And so this was a way for DAR to institutionalize Holomua, right? Now you have 2 civil service positions who are leading this initiative, right? And so it's bringing this initiative back into DAR's wheelhouse so that we can make sure that we're bringing on the right people, right? There's 5 seats that are taken. We have that extra seat to go and pick up for these areas that we go to. It's not our places that we're going to, so we're listening to those areas. We're listening to the folks on those islands to see where would these tools fit best for your island. Next slide, please. Right, so we got the who, we got the why, we got the when, it's by 2030, right? So the where is Holomua, right? So it's from the high tide watermark out to 50 meters of depth or 164 feet. We're looking at 30% of each of the islands, right? So each island is connected. Each island has their own kind of ecosystem that they're working with, their own stakeholders on those islands. And so we want to work with those islands to create their own networks, right? That are ecologically connected. And we're talking about the whole nearshore area, right? One of the things with this initiative with Holomua is that DAR is adopting Holomua as our nearshore management plan, right? So it doesn't matter who's the next governor because DAR has already adopted this as our nearshore management plan. So we are going to be paddling this canoe for our nearshore management using Holomua, right? And it's also the connection from Mauka to Makai, right? So we have DOFA up Mauka, who is fencing off areas, protecting 30% of watershed, and we are taking care of the 30% of the Makai side, right? So it's making sure that the Mauka to Makai connection is there. Next slide, please. Okay, and then how do we do this, right? So we have 4 different pillars that we're looking at. So the place-based planning is kind of working with, like I said, those islands, right? What does that 30% of marine management areas look like? Where are the areas that this would benefit, right? And like I said, it's not us. We're not the ones that are driving it. We're piloting our canoe over there, working with a template that island, those stakeholders can then make sure that it fits to Maui, it fits to Lanai, it fits to Hawaii Island, right? Because we're all different. We have created an MOU with local philanthropy to establish the partnership so that we can advance Holomua. And that includes being inclusive and transparent. We have a Holomua website, newsletters that we have been able to add information for different initiatives like the Herbivore initiative that David had mentioned. We also have a roadmap to 30 by 30 of how we're going to accomplish this. And we also got an evaluator for our initiative. One of the things we want to make sure is that as we're moving forward this initiative, that we are able to track our progress, right? So evaluate how are we doing. We have Pono practices, which is our, I'll share a little bit more. We have monitoring and we have protection and restoration. So I'm going to jump into each of these a little bit more. Next slide, please. And so place-based planning is really working with the fishers, the communities, the stakeholders to build this ecologically connected network of areas right on their islands. To help with that, we created some tools. So we have a marine management planning guide. And this is a framework for interested communities to kind of get together. What are their goals and objectives for the area? What tools are they looking at so that in 5 years, we can come back and evaluate, hey, are we reaching these goals? Have these objectives been met? And if not, what are the next steps to make sure that we are reaching them? We currently have 58 areas and we're looking at creating, or we're drafting management plans from each of those so that we can make sure in 5 years, we can go back and look at how these areas are progressing. Next slide, please. And so point of practices, right? Everybody's like, oh, you guys managing 30%. What about the other 70, right? So we have point of practices, right? And this is how we provide the education and outreach, right? The improved regulations. Sometimes you don't have to create more regulations. You just need to build that compliance. And that comes from education and outreach. So we have our education and staff going out and providing outreach at various events. We have our officers. We just graduated a class, DOCA graduated a class of civilians. And so they were looking for hunters and fishers who are just ordinary people who show up and they're like, oh, you know, looking at the beach, they can scan and be like, oh, these uncles is fine. What are these guys doing over here? Because they have that fishing mentality and they're better kind of acquainted to the fields that they're in. Next slide, please. So monitoring, right? So when we create these regulations and areas, like how do we know that they're successful? So we're looking at tracking different things, different regulations that we have, as well as incorporating community based data, right? So there's certain areas like Ha'en on Kauai, where they're creating regulations for things that they're owner for, right? So they're targeting he'e or octopus, right? And so DAR doesn't really monitor that specifically. So partnering with communities who go and malama these resources and be like, how do you know there's enough he'e out there? Like, how do you know what is the sustainable amount? And then starting to use those protocols when we're making management decisions for those areas and evaluating how effective those management regulations are. Next slide, please. Right, and so not only is it the ecological and biological monitoring, right, and community monitoring, we also have enforcement monitoring, right? And so DoCare, they have their DLNR tip app, and so this is kind of what comes into the system, right? So everybody putting in their DLNR tips, we can start to see, or DoCare can start to see like where those violations are happening and start to identify hotspots and when those hotspots are occurring, right? And it can help them better set up how would they go out and, you know, enforce these different areas based upon the input that is being submitted. And so folks may be like, hey, I'm not getting nothing back. Well, this is one of those slides where we show people like, hey, your information is being compiled and it's helping DoCare to kind of get a better picture of what the landscape looks like as far as illegal activity. Next slide, please. Right, and then the final pillar is protection and restoration. And so you'll hear from some folks on our aquatic invasive species team about the projects that they are doing for this. Next slide, please. All right, and then what's next, right? So as David mentioned, we have community-based subsistence fishing areas. So both Miloli'i just conducted their statewide scoping last month in December. And so we're working with them to kind of finalize their rule package to present before the BLNR to enter Chapter 91. We're determining with Kipohulu when they're going to have their statewide scoping happening. We are working with the Mauna Lua community to develop a fisheries management area that they came to us and was like, hey, we're interested in working with you folks to develop management for our area. We had our statewide scoping for our herbivore initiative, so we will be finalizing that rule package as well and taking that before the board to enter to Chapter 91. We're working with the community-based monitoring hui. Like I mentioned, like there's data that communities are gathering that will help fill the pukas in DAR's data set. And so partnering with those communities so that we have a better picture. We have worked with communities and UH to develop social culture indicators, right? And so DAR has always evaluated our areas based on like percent coral cover, fish biomass, fish diversity, right? This is taking into account that people factor, right? So when the uncle's going out to fishing, is he taking another person or is he taking a keiki with him, right? Because if he is, that's generational knowledge that is being passed on. When he's catching the fish, is he just feeding his house, putting food on the table for them? Or is he feeding the neighbors? Is he getting it for ho'okupu for a ceremony? Is he getting it from makana as a gift for another family, right? So taking into these different aspects, the social culture perspectives when we're evaluating our management areas. And then, like I said, this community engagement process, making sure it's inclusive and transparent as we work with the different islands to determine what their 30% of MMAs will look like for their island network. And so I believe that's my last slide. Thank you.
Should we just roll into the next one here?
Hey, go ahead, Ryan.
Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. My name's Ryan Jenkinson. I'm the head of the Protected Species Program at DAR. And what I was hoping to do here is introduce you to our program and give you kind of population recovery management updates on 3 of the more high profile species that we deal with. I do want to start off by just mentioning that, you know, the native endemic animals and plants of Hawaii are a huge thing, and the state spends a lot of money on it. You tend to hear a lot more of it from the terrestrial side, though, with work on conserving birds or invertebrates, or even the native plants and trees of the islands. And even though these species, these marine species that are endangered, are high profile and such a huge part of the islands and the culture, we hear less about it from the state side. And I think it's because the federal government, because these animals are listed and they often occur outside of that 3-mile zone, take up a lot of the press, and people think about them as federally listed species. But the state, we really hold this unique, super important position in managing and recovering these animals. So I want to highlight that today and what the program does and the type of work we do. So next slide. Like I mentioned, I'm not going to go through all of the marine species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act that we deal with. It includes some new coral species that are going to be listed here pretty soon that are found up in the monument. But rather, I'm going to concentrate on 3 of the more high profile ones for you guys. I'm happy to answer questions about pelagic manta rays or white-tip sharks or hawksbill sea turtles. We do work on all of those things. I'm just not going to highlight them here. So next slide. So turtles and seals and things are really high profile, and tourists run into them and they gain a lot of attention. But we do have a bunch of listed pelagic species, which people just don't see as often, although the fishing community runs into them quite a bit. So they're a little bit less high profile, but they are becoming a bigger deal. And I'm going to highlight one species in particular here for you guys. Next slide. So these are false killer whales. They're not false because they're fake. They're false because before anyone actually saw one of these alive, they actually found skeletal remains in the skulls of them, and they thought they were just small killer whales. And then when they actually saw them alive, they were like, well, that's not a killer whale at all. So their common name is false killer whales. They are found all around the world, but the ones around Hawaii are unique. So the next slide. It's hard to think about managing them, and I think the easiest way is to explain them in the context of actual killer whales, just because a lot of people know the orca story and how their groups are organized. So on the West Coast, there are 3 distinct groups of actual killer whales. So there's the resident whales that are well known. They feed on fish and salmon. They're around Seattle and Vancouver. SeaWorld catches them and turns them into shamus, or they used to. So those are kind of the most well-known ones, but there's actually a group called transient killer whales. Those are the ones that actually eat other whales and dolphins and things. You've probably seen videos of them throwing dolphins and marine mammals up into the air. And then there's a group that's mostly found offshore. They don't interact with each other. Even though they're found in the same areas, they only reproduce within their groups. And so we have a really similar thing here with false killer whales in the Hawaiian Islands. There's these 3 groups called insular, offshore, and those found up in the Monument or Northwest Hawaiian Islands. The ones we're concentrating on here is this insular population. And so this is a group that only reproduces with themselves, that are found right inshore in the main Hawaiian Islands. There's probably around 150 of them left. And we think that population is decreasing. We don't have a full census on them. They're hard to see. They're part of this group of animals, if any of you guys fish, are called, often referred to as blackfish, which are this group of small cetaceans, like pygmy killer whales, false killer whales, that just look like small dolphins, kind of. Excuse me. So having an actual population count is difficult. There's aerial photos from the 80s of groups of 400 plus of these things. So it's probably decreasing. There's very few of them. And the reason I wanted to highlight them for you guys is because there are so few, it is highly likely that the federal government is going to start instituting some really strict rules about working around or being around these animals. And it's going to have a huge impact on both the commercial and recreational fisheries in the nearshore waters. They target the fish that we target. That's what they eat: mahi, ahi, ono, and things like that. The problems that we have with recovery are, one, there's so few of them. There's so few females that they might be too far gone to actually continuously reproduce over time. And secondly, because we target the same species, they do interact with fisheries. Sorry, a large number of them actually can be seen with hooks in their mouths. So I wanted to talk about these guys for the committee here, because I think you're going to hear a lot more about them in the near future. Next slide. So the next species I want to talk about is honu. Honu, these are probably some of the most iconic animals in Hawaii. They're green sea turtles. They're found around the world, green sea turtles are, but the animals to Hawaii are distinct to Hawaii. They don't leave and go reproduce with others. It's a self-contained group. Next slide. I have like an all-time tickle in my throat. It's good timing. So our Hawaiian green sea turtles are managed as this distinct population segment. And what's unique about them is, although we don't have a total count for the species, the population is increasing really rapidly, actually, at 5 to 7% per year. So they actually are a success story for conservation and rehabilitation of an endangered species. The reason they're not being delisted is because of one simple thing. You can go to the next slide. Is that most of them, about 90% of them, laid their eggs out in the monument at Lalo or French Frigate Shoals. And 3 or now 4 years ago, Hurricane Malacca went through there and completely wiped out the islands that they nest on. Along with sea level rise, their native nesting habitat is gone. So what we've seen over the last few years is them redistributing a large part into the main Hawaiian Islands, and we're seeing all this increased nesting. So on Oahu, annually, there used to be between 5 and 10 nests. We've had over 90 of them over the last 2 years. And so the reason the federal government is hesitant to delist this species is they're not sure where their new nesting grounds are going to be, if it might be in the main Hawaiian Islands. They also interact with fisheries, get tangled in line, they'll take bait that's near shore. And then with all of this nesting in the main islands, lights on land disturbs the new hatchlings. People drive over them with ATVs, dogs and animals around them. So, sorry, these are new issues that we're dealing with green sea turtles. We have to deal with the fact that there's a lot more of these animals in the main islands, and we see them come up and bask on these beaches that are high profile locations like Poipu on Kauai, or Lanakea on Oahu, or Ho'okipa on Maui. And we're dealing with tourists around them and people, and they're still listed as endangered. And you may have noticed people get really fired up about them and want to protect them. So these are actually interesting things to work with endangered species. Like, there's so many of them. Those are issues. And it's actually led to another thing where there's, this happens periodically, but a push to reinstitute native harvest of these animals, because people see so many of them. It has historically been part of the culture. That has to go through federal rule changes, international treaty and stuff before it gets to the state level, but that is something we're dealing with. Next slide. So the last species I want to talk about is maybe the most high profile as far as the media and things are Hawaiian monk seals. So this is one of the rarest mammals on Earth. They're only found here in Hawaii. So next slide. There's about 1,400 of them on the latest census total, 350 or so of which are found in the main Hawaiian Islands. For reference, the federal recovery goal for the species is about 3,000 total animals and about 500 of them living in the main Hawaiian Islands. So we're not that far from that point. The population is growing slowly over the last 5 to 7 years at about 2%. So that's really good. But, geez, I'm really sorry. That leads to all kinds of issues that we have to deal with that are pretty high profile. So I'm going to talk about some of the threats to recovery of these. And some of this stuff's not pretty. And the things that we deal with Hawaiian monk seals are difficult to see. So just a little heads up for the next slide. I think it's important for you guys to see what some of these threats look like. So next slide. One of our big issues is how the general public and the culture interprets monk seals and how they feel they fit into nearshore Hawaiian waters and how important they are as a cultural symbol and whether or not they belong here. A lot of our work is cultural in nature and working with communities on these animals, but we still have them being intentionally killed, especially on Molokai. We had 6 of them last year. So on the right, you can see a young female from September with a bullet hole in her head. And these are the kinds of things that we deal with these animals. Another big one is hooking with fisheries. You can see an animal with a hook. We have one right now. I'm getting calls. We have one with a hook down its throat right now on Oahu. We're trying to find, we're going to bring it in and try to do a emergency operation to take the hook out of its throat. That's pretty common. They get caught in gill nets and lay nets and things. And then finally, the third that might be the most difficult is disease, primarily this disease called toxoplasmosis that is spread exclusively through cats. And so the non-native feral cats that are found in Hawaii, which is an issue for all kinds of wildlife, have a huge impact on the recovery of monk seals. And it especially targets females, which is really difficult with such a low population number. Next slide. So I'm happy to answer questions about those species and the type of work we do, but I just want to highlight like what our program does. And we work on a variety of things, but it's especially community-based. It overlaps a lot with the 30 by 30 things, working with communities, trying to help them understand the role of these animals. We have programs like the barbless circle hook project, which distributes barbless circle hooks so they're easier to remove from the animals if they're hooked. We respond when these animals are hooked and help the different agencies work on response to them. Sorry. We do formal education. We have work in the classrooms. We work with the DOE to produce lesson plans long-term throughout grade school. We do targeted outreach at fishing tournaments. We run volunteer programs to monitor the animals. Next page. We do specific science work with the Science Center at NOAA. So we run surveys like at Nihihau in places where the federal government can't get into. We capture animals and tag them. We help with removal of debris that they get entangled in. We work on the management actions that David talked about, like changes to lay net rules and drone fishing. Work on trying to remove cats, reduce disease transmission, and working on a state management plan that describes all of this work that the state does and what our long-term goals are. Next slide. So this is our team. We pretty much have one person on each island to do all of this for all of these animals and all of the different programs. And unfortunately, because of how funding works for us, the two on the left there on Oahu have left the program recently. So next slide. I want to finish up just really quick with our funding. I'm the only general funded civil service person who works on these animals for the state for everything. So the rest of the program and the staff are funded through NOAA federal grants that we are not guaranteed. And in fact, we didn't get last year for a lot of reasons. And that's why we're losing people. What's so difficult here is, unlike some of the endangered species terrestrial ones that you guys know about, we can't build a fence around something or do a small project and save these things. These are long-term, community-based work that requires people to be in positions to work on this stuff. So we're really interested in finding more long-term funding from the state level to help the program continue. And whether that comes from like the Ocean Stewardship Fund or maybe green fees the state institutes, we're really keen on working with you guys on trying to figure a way to help us be more proactive in working with these animals. Happy to answer questions. Usually people do later, but maybe at the end. Thank you.
All right.
Oh, excuse me.
Sorry.
Please proceed. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Hi, good morning. I'm Lizzie Monahan, and I am the Ballast Water and Biofouling Planner for DAR's Aquatic Invasive Species team. And Kim Fuller, the aquatic biologist, and I are going to be introducing our team, some of the things that we work on, and some of our main goals. Okay, next slide. An aquatic invasive species is any non-native aquatic species, if introduced into an ecosystem, may cause harm to our economy, our environment, human health, public safety, or welfare, or often a combination of these different factors. In Hawaii, there's about 463 introduced marine species, 86 introduced freshwater species, for a total of about 550 introduced aquatic species. Next slide. An important part of my position is focusing on these two vectors or ways species get introduced to Hawaii. So about 78% of all marine species introductions to Hawaii happen through either ballast water operations or biofouling of vessel hulls. Ballast water is water that's taken up or released to properly weight a vessel, depending on its cargo. And when water is taken up, it can carry with it organisms that can then be transported and released to other places in the ocean. Hull biofouling are these entire communities of organisms that can grow on the bottom of vessel hulls. So this can be anything from bacteria up into macroorganisms, including algae or small crustaceans, things like that. Other vectors that aquatic invasive species get introduced by to Hawaii include marine debris, aquarium or aquaculture escape, or intentional release of animals. Next slide. Our current protections against ballast water and biofouling include Hawaii State Administrative Rules, Chapter 13-76, which requires vessels to manage ballast water in an approved method and submit a ballast water reporting form when they're traveling to Hawaii. So our team processed 729 of these ballast water management report forms in 2020. We also developed a risk assessment tool that allows us to target vessels that have risky ballast water operations for ballast water inspections. And as for biofouling, there's no current regulations. However, our team does support NOAA in performing hull inspections looking for invasive species on vessels that are headed to the Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument. Next slide. The Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, or VIDA, is a federal regulation that will preempt states from developing and enforcing ballast water and vessel hull in-water cleaning regulations. So the DLNR has collaborated in the last few years with CGAPs in meeting with and providing comments to the EPA and the US Coast Guard during the development of these new federal regulations. And these regulations will prevent us from coming up with regulations that are more stringent than these federal regulations. They will allow us to enforce or co-enforce the new federal regulations. And we will also be allowed to have our own regulations that mirror these federal regulations. However, we will not be able to charge shipping fees or shipping companies a fee to support this regulatory work, which means there's no revenue to build a DAR team to help enforce these regulations. Next slide. This is an example of why having an aquatic invasive species team is so important. Stony coral tissue loss disease is a disease that has been affecting corals in the Caribbean. It has an extremely high mortality rate across most coral species in the Caribbean, but it hasn't made it to Hawaii yet, or the Pacific. So the spread of stony coral tissue loss disease throughout the Caribbean is unexplained by natural water movement, which means it's likely related to ballast water or hull fouling. So that's why our team is really important to look at these vectors and make sure that this disease doesn't make it to the Pacific. So our team has been participating in working groups and workshops in order to develop prevention survey and response plans for when this disease becomes an issue in the Pacific. Next slide. Another program our team has in order to identify potential new invasive species are these autonomous reef monitoring structures, or ARMS. They are settlement plates that were deployed to select harbors in throughout the Hawaiian Islands in 2018. And the goals of this project is to build species checklists to understand what species are present in our harbor, build a voucher collection and DNA barcode reference library for these species, and also to identify any new species. So far, these plates have been collected on Oahu from Honolulu Harbor and Barbers Point. And then our next stops will be traveling to Kauai, Maui, and Hawaii Island to collect the settlement plates there. So far, 131 unique species have been reported through this project, including one new record for Hawaii and a new species of amphipod that was described and published back in November. And then we also have 157 ideal vouchers for our reference library. Next slide.
So I'm going to start presenting from now. Thanks, Lizzie. She's been covering, the importance of prevention, which is one of the most effective strategies that we have in an aquatic invasive species management. One other thing that we're trying to work to prevent to get to the main Hawaiian Islands is Chondria tumulosa. So that is found currently in Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument at Pearl and Hermes and Midway Atoll. It's just been smothering the reefs and causing habitat shifts that are detrimental for the ecology up there. So since we know it is up in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands and there is shipping movement and research that's occurring up there, we're working with our partners, our federal partners, to develop best management practices to reduce the likelihood of the spread to the main Hawaiian Islands. And then also within the National Monument, because we at DAR are co-managers of that monument, we suspect that it's able to spread through ballast water, hull fouling, potentially vessel traffic, and also any like research gear, scuba gear and things like that they're using up there. So we really hope to prevent that, and are also, as technology develops, we will be monitoring the main Hawaiian Islands for if it does come here, to rapidly respond to it. Next slide, please. So since 2020, we have rapidly responded to 4 high-risk introductions. Rapid response is important in that right when you can detect a small population of an invasive species as when it's most likely to be eradicated. So these were instances where the distribution was not widespread, and we were able to either remove or smother the invasive species that were posing a threat to our ecosystems. So one of these was a dry dock that came from Washington. It was heavily fouled. Luckily, they had cleaned it before, but upon inspecting the hull, we still did find invasive species on the hull. So one of these sea stars has caused shellfishery decline in other areas, and we luckily removed everything that we found on that dry dock. In Kaneohe, we had several species of corals and a species of anemone that we were able to remove. On Kauai this past year, we found illegal outplantings of corals in collaboration with Kauai DAR team and removed them. And now our federal partners are hopefully looking to enforce the regulations on that if we can. So we also found a corallimorph in the Alawai, and that's that blue disc-like thing. They're actually quite beautiful and popular in the aquarium trade, but corallimorphs in Palmyra particularly have caused complete devastation to coral reefs. So we were able to smother that species in the Alawai. Next slide, please. So once you get beyond rapid response, it's about management, long-term management. What we have been doing for the past decade is in Kaneohe Bay, they mechanically removed smothering seaweed, which is another invasive algae that just completely covers coral and kills it. So they mechanically removed it, and we still to this day outplant urchins as the native biocontrol. So the urchins are produced at a Nui Nui Fisheries Research Center at Sun Island on Oahu. And then we outplant them onto the reefs to graze the algae. So the herbivory pressure is helping the reef to still recover and thrive. So that was a restorative effort. And to this day, we still outplant urchins. So in total, 850,000 urchins have been produced and outplanted. We also now outplant in the Waikiki Marine Life Conservation District. So we have treated about 30 acres in Waikiki, and Kaneohe, we cover 235 acres. We also are looking to expand this tool. So we've done several pilot projects with community groups and researchers to see how we could further use this tool in other areas. Next slide. We also manage freshwater, aquatic invasive species, and estuarine as well. But this past year, we were able to send over some of our team to Kauai, and we removed a lot of water hyacinth. You can see there's a big pile next to that truck. It's pretty much bigger than that truck. It was in a reservoir, and Kauai DAR was concerned that with the rainy season, it would spread to the lower reaches of the water system. And so we just went over there and removed the water hyacinth before it had time to pour over into the lower reaches, which currently do not have water hyacinth. We also, I think with our freshwater aquatic invasive species management too, it's really about outreach, because while marine species are mostly through ballast water and hull fouling, in freshwater species are mostly through releases. So whether they be accidental or intentional, it's through aquarium or aquaculture species being released into our freshwater ways. So really providing information for our communities to understand that releasing them into our freshwater systems is a major point for freshwater and estuarine aquatic invasive species management. Next slide. So as civil servants, we also you know, contribute to the larger goals of DAR. We rapidly respond to grounding events. So some of the more recent events that we've been working on, we've investigated the Honolulu dredging damage. Ko'olina, there was an anchor damage incident. We participated in the Pacific Paradise. And recently we had done our monitoring for the recovery of the Flattery grounding. Next slide. So there are some challenges in 2022. An anticipated challenge is the inability to generate revenue with VEDA under the current regulations. And we have had 3 unfunded civil service positions since 2020. So we've been running on a team of 4 funded positions out of 7 total civil service positions, which, you know, if we can fill those positions, we could really expand our capacity and reach. Next slide. So the priorities for this year are going to be to work to enact the new regulations under VEDA, complete the ARMS project to understand the species present in our harbors, prioritize prevention and response to species of concern and pathways that are high risk, and continue invasive algae management with native urchin biocontrol. And again, if we could expand our program capacity, we could definitely expand our reach. Next. So if you would like to contact us, we have Lizzie's email, my email, and Brian's email. We also have a webpage that covers aquatic invasive species specifically. And thank you for your time today.
Okay, we have just one last slide, so I appreciate you hanging in there with us. So just a look at DAR's priorities for the coming fiscal year. Thanks to this committee, we were able to pass our legislative wish list last session. So we're really focusing on implementing all of those great bills that were passed last session. So we actually don't have any administrative bills for this session, but are looking forward to engaging in the process for other aquatic related bills this session. So our main priority this year is our budget, where we're still trying to recover from the budget crisis last year. As Kim mentioned, we're trying to hopefully find funding again for the aquatic invasive species team. As she mentioned, 3 positions were cut, and you know, they're critically important for managing invasive species, but also you know, being able to respond to these environmental damage events as well as our lead dive team. We're also trying to restore operating funds as well, which were cut, I think, around 40% last year. A piece of that also funded the Holomua Marine 30 by 30 initiative that was established in 2019 to fund a couple of our contract positions. So we're hoping to regain those funds back. And then we've got a couple additional position requests, an aquaculture biologist and a coral curator biologist. We've got CIP requests in to upgrade our Nui Fisheries Research Center. Fortunately, we've had a couple of committee members visit that facility. That's where the sea urchin hatchery and coral nursery is based out of, and also the trout fishery for Kauai. And then we also have a request in to support fish pond fingerling productions. That's something that the fish pond community is called for. And then some ceiling adjustments, Sport Fish Special Fund, also to establish a ceiling for the Ocean Stewardship Special Fund. We're actually not able to use that fund yet because a ceiling hasn't been established yet. And this isn't part of our supplemental budget request, but I know there is a House bill and a Senate bill, a request to support our FAD program. These are the fish attraction devices or fish aggregation devices throughout the state that we manage to enhance fisheries, but that program's taken a big hit. We've lost about half of the FADs currently, so we're looking just for some stopgap funding to get that program back at 100% capacity with the plan for the non-resident marine fishing license to be able to fund this program long-term. So we definitely are going to be supporting those bills as they get heard. And so that's it. We're happy to take any questions. And again, just really appreciate this opportunity today. Aloha.
Thank you very much for that great presentation. Members, we're now open for questions and discussion. If you could please raise your digital hand if you have a question. Okay, Chair Tarnas, please.
Thank you, Vice Chair, and certainly the other members of the committee, I'm sure, have plenty of questions as well, but I'll start out. Could you brief us on the bottom fish restricted fishing area, the plans that you have for opening up? I know that's a land board decision, but what is the division's approach to this?
Yeah, so if you're not familiar, the bottom fish restriction areas were established decades ago. This was in response to some of the NOAA fishery stock assessments that were showing that the bottom fish stocks were not doing so great. And so a variety of different management measures were implemented back then, including these areas that closed all bottom fishing I believe there was 12 different bottom fishing restricted areas established throughout the state. Since then, there's been an annual catch limit has been established. So that's really the main management tool for the bottom fishery is an annual catch limit where all commercial bottom fishers report how many bottom fish they catch. And that goes, that's totaled. And once an annual catch limit is reached, then the fishery is shut down. Fortunately, we're not even close to reaching that annual catch limit. And the stock assessments by NOAA have been developed over time, and the bottom fish stocks are considered sustainable. And so there's a lot of questions as to whether these bottom fish restricted areas are even needed anymore with the annual catch limit. So DAR did recommend opening 4 of the 12 BRFAs 3 years ago, and the board did approve those. So we opened 4 of them. But part of the board's recommendation was that DAR go back to the land board 3 years later and report back on the status of the bottom fish areas that we opened. Did we see spikes in fishing? Did the catch go up? How did the fishery respond? So we have plans to bring that back to the board early this year to give them a report out on how the fishery is doing, and then hopefully we can also discuss the bottom fish restricted areas and how important of a conservation tool they are for the fishery. Sorry for the
if I could ask a real quick follow-up, Vice Chair. So what is your preliminary conclusions from the work that you've done on the existing BRFAs in terms of opening up additional BRFAs?
So number one, as I said, all the stock assessments show that the bottom fish fishery is sustainable. There's no concerns that we have in terms of the fishery. So that's kind of our first box to check. In terms of the effectiveness of the BRFAs and providing a conservation benefit, we did try to implement a study to have fishers report how much catch occurred in the BRFAs that we opened after the fishery. And honestly, the reporting wasn't super great to be able to make a strong determination if there was any sort of effect. We definitely didn't see a spike in catch overall. So, our feeling now is the BRFAs aren't really providing a whole lot of conservation benefit. We feel that the annual catch limit is the best tool to manage those fisheries. So we will be bringing that up at the board meeting, when we report back early this year.
Thank you. Back to you, Vice Chair.
Thank you. Representative Morikawa.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Thank you, Vice Chair. I have a few questions, but let me begin with, since Chair Tarnas mentioned the bottom fishing stock, do you guys have any data on the impact seals may be having on fish populations? Because fishermen seem to think that they're eating a lot of shoreline stocks.
I'm going to ask our biologist, Ryan Jenkinson, to address that question.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a really common thing that we run into. Yes, we have data to demonstrate how much a seal would eat in a day or over a given time period and how many seals. It does not impact the population status of the fish, but it's part of what's hard about working with these species is if you're a fisher and you're out there though, and you see the seal eating the fish, you're like, what are you talking about? I'm watching them eat them. But on the larger scale of how many fish are taken out by fishers and how many are there already in standing stock, the seals do very little. But it's not to make it not valid for fishers to question that, if that makes sense. And I can provide those actual numbers if you want. I don't.
Okay, because I fish and I'm finding it harder to catch fish. But
Yeah.
let me just go into my second question. I mean, thank you for the update, by the way. And, you know, although I appreciate rules and enforcement, I have a greater concern for those local residents who may be cited for inadvertent violations, like catching that prize undersized moi or papio for dinner. And then somehow the doe care guys are right there watching them and they get cited, right? I mean, at what point will doe care do more educating before citations? Or can we think about limiting, instead of size, maybe like trout and coquet, you just limit it to how many you can catch? I mean, like in coquet, if you catch a small little one, sorry, you got to take it because it's not going to survive after you hook it anyway. And in other instances, that's what happens when people are fishing. You try to throw it back, but it's not going to survive after you've caught it. Comment?
David, do you want to address?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I don't want to speak for doe care, but, you know, I know they are trying to build their trust with the community, and, you know, they do have a reputation, and they're trying to change that under Jason's leadership. You know, there's a reason we have certain regulations like minimum sizes or bag limits or season restrictions, and it's based on the length at reproduction or the spawning seasons or their population numbers. So you know, it's science-based, and, you know, it's not the same as like trout fishing, but, you know, we are trying to do more outreach through our 30 by 30 Holomua initiative to educate people not only what the rules are, but the reasons for the rules. Like we're teaching people, you know, we have a minimum size limit because that's the size that 50% of them are reproductively mature, and we want to ensure that enough of them can survive to adulthood to reproduce, so that you have more fish for you and your keiki in the future. And I think as people understand why they have these limits, then there's more incentive to comply because they want to do what's right.
Okay, and Vice Chair, I have one more question. When I was a child, we lived in poverty. So, you know, a lot of the times we needed to depend on the ocean for the food that we get. And one of those was the turtle. The delicacies was the turtle. But, you know, we know that now people are saying because of the protection and the increased population, they look sick and diseased, so we wouldn't eat them anyway. But at what point do we continue to increase that population?
Like I mentioned, this is something that has come up quite a bit, and we've had meetings both with our group with DAR and with NOAA about this stuff. It's a little bit out of the state hands because they're federally listed and there's international treaties on them. Those hurdles would have to be overcome before we could get to the state deciding. I can tell you from a wildlife management and from my perspective as a biologist, I would support a limited harvesting with the population that we have here, but we can't make that change. Like, we can't overturn these federal rules. So we're interested in listening to people talk about it and discuss it, and we'll support that push, but it's a little bit out of our hands right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Members, any further questions? If I may ask a question, Mr. Jenkinson, thank you for highlighting the false killer whales. That was good for me to learn. What can we do to help the population? What measures can we take?
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting that folds into some of the DAR programs, it's going to be where the nexus of the federal kind of restriction might come have to do with these fads that we put out there, because there's this idea that these aggregating devices that bring a bunch of fish together also bring the whales in there, and that's where interactions are happening. But there's really no data or proof that that's happening. So I think the best thing, honestly, I think awareness is our biggest thing, because people don't know about these animals, and there's not like a specific, we're going to stop them from getting hooked, or we can suddenly make the population size go up. I just think having general awareness about these animals here and being careful around. So our work with them is more about talking to fishers, asking them for information. Where are you seeing the animal? Like, where are you guys running into them? Where do you see them? Are they taking your fish? No one's in trouble for anything. We have so little information about them that I think that's our best way to make kind of informed decisions moving forward, is just having more information. So we're working a lot with the commercial and recreational fishers to give us information about when they see the animals. Take pictures of them, because you can identify them based on their dorsal fin. And so we actually have a program with the groups we work with to give out cameras to have people take pictures and just get them excited about these really cool animals they're running into, and they don't know much about them either. They're really interesting. Sorry, this is long, but they're so social and gregarious that they share their catch of like mahi and stuff among themselves. And in Hawaii and other places where false killer whales are, they'll actually sometimes catch fish and bring them to fishermen. They'll bring it to the boat and set it there for people to share if there's a lot of fish around. They're really cool animals. So we want people to kind of just be aware of them and share information with us. I think that's the best thing we can do.
Thank you for that. And also, just to reiterate and to drive the point, if you could just kind of share the connection again between the feral cat population and how that's impacting our monk seal population, please.
Yeah, so toxoplasmosis is an amoebic disease, and the only carrier of that amoeba is cats. And so they shed the amoeba eggs in their feces, and then the poop gets washed down through the watersheds into the water, and it's either ingested by the seals or it's ingested by fish that then the seals eat. People actually can get toxoplasmosis also from cats. And so people that have a lot of cats or around them have neurological issues and things. It is a human disease that affects people, and especially newborns. So we actually have someone on one of the committees that we work on with the cat stuff that has a child that was born blind from toxoplasmosis from being raised around cats. So the cats are the only vector of that disease in spreading it.
Thank you. Your Tarnas?
Thanks, Vice Chair, and thanks very much to the DAR team for the presentation today. I got a question about aquatic invasive species. Are you going to be able to handle all the necessary things through rulemaking, or do you expect that there to be some legislation that will be required? Maybe Kim or Lizzie?
Well, I think for as far as the vector goes for ballast water and biofouling, it's all going to be superseded by VETA. But there has been we are trying to petition to get certain high-risk species listed as prohibited. There are two different ways that can happen. So I'm not very clear on it, but I know that in the past there has been legislation to like prohibit the sale of Sylvinia and things like that.
David, Sakota, do you have anything to add to that? Just because I know it's a concern of the committee members, and they're saying, well, do we need to do legislation, or is it all going to be done through rulemaking?
Even if there were state legislation, that would be preempted by the federal regulations. So I think that's important to understand that, because our hands will be tied from whatever regulations the EPA promulgates, it's important that our team works closely with EPA to develop regulations that will address all the unique threats to Hawaii, and that's what our team is focusing on.
Okay.
So yeah, so no, in short, like specifically toward incidental discharge, ballast water hull fouling, I don't think specific legislative authority or mandates would do anything. If anything, like Kim was mentioning, making sure that our team is fully funded so that we have the staff to implement those regulations is important. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Nielsen, you want to comment on that too?
Yeah, I was just going to add, there is still a question as to whether hull fouling or biofouling, the stuff that grows on the outside of the ship, is considered incidental discharge under VITA. And I know, California is fighting this hard. So, as VITA rolls out, some questions still will be answered, and maybe this is something that we could address in future sessions once the federal government provides some clarity on some of these questions.
Okay, well, we look forward to that. We don't want to get out in front and just be preempted. So if you could keep us informed as we go forward, that's very important. Chair, if I ask another question?
Absolutely, Chair.
Thanks. On these groundings, you mentioned Honolulu Harbor dredging, Paradise, Flattery. How are the fines determined, and where does the money go?
So I can take a stab at that. So we've developed a matrix for valuing corals and live rock based on their size, their morphology, which relates to their ecosystem function, the rarity of the corals, whether they're located in a protected area or sensitive area. And it's only been used, relatively recently in the past 8 years or so. And we're starting to use that as the standard for developing our proposed penalties for these incidents. Generally, we pursue these through administrative action before the Board of Land and Natural Resources. And a lot of them actually settle. And so because it's a settlement, which is a contractual agreement, they get put into a trust fund. And we can use those revenues for specific trust purposes. If it is an actual a fine or penalty that the board imposes, then that would go into that would go back to the board into the enforcement special fund, or now that we have the ocean stewardship fund, it could go into that fund. But it does stay within DLNR for resource management. It doesn't go back into the general fund.
So the trust fund, though, are the purposes defined in the trust fund if that's where the settlement would put the money?
Yeah, the purposes would be defined in that trust agreement.
And I just want to make sure that DAR gets the money, and I worry that it gets somewhere else. What has been the practice?
Yeah, so in some of them, it's like when it's joint federal and state enforcement, DAR, I think it's like housed with NOAA, but we have access to those funds. We just need to write proposals. With like molasses, I think the AG controls the funds, and DAR has access to those funds. But with like a lot of the coral damage ones, it does go straight to a trust fund that we manage. And as long as we need to make sure that it's expended for trust purposes, but we decide how we want to spend that money within that.
Okay, thank you. If I may, I'd like to ask other questions from committee members. I'm happy to defer, but otherwise I do have a couple other questions.
Please, Chair.
This next one is about CBSFAs. Luna, you're probably the one for this. We've gotten some concerns from different communities about CBSFAs that, it's, on Molokai, for example, there was a lot of Pilikia that was happening there. How do you approach that and try to build consensus within a community in order to come up with these proposed rules so that they're fair, protect the resource, but also, honor that there may be people from outside that area that would like to come in and fish, and so they sometimes feel excluded. What's your approach to that? Because it's your kuleana.
So there's actually a good example from Haena. I think of Uncle Press and Uncle KD, and David shared this a couple of times of how they approach CBSFA and how they want people to come and fish. They're like, you guys can come fish our area, but there's a certain way that we fish over here. So if you can fish like us, like that's how we would appreciate. So they're not saying like, no, come and fish our area, but there's certain way that certain communities fish. And so being open to that, and it being their place, and them just accepting everybody and being like, hey, we want you guys to come and fish, but there's a certain way that we practice over here. And so that's kind of the approach. As far as Mo'omomi, so I kind of was the fourth quarterback in this one, but seeing the lessons learned and listening, there's a lot of the same practices, right? That they go and feed their families. That's what they're going out to fish for, right? And so it really comes back to, it's the practice. Right now, they both agree on the practice. It's the community of where there's the issues. And so that's kind of like, it's not really the resources that people are concerned about. It's more of that social piece. And DAR is just starting to dabble in that. Like I said, we got social culture indicators that we're developing to start to look at that in these management areas. So I think that's one thing to think about is when you look at Molokai, they're both thinking that, we're practicing for subsistence. We're practicing so that we can feed our families. They have different opinions on what that is. And it's that pilikia between the families right now that is causing it to trickle back into the resources. And that would just be my perspective on it.
I appreciate that. I mean, it's a challenge. I appreciate that. Mr. Nielsen, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just add also to that, with the CBSFAs, a lot of the controversy and stuff that we hear about it is about the rules, but there's a ton of stewardship that is also involved with these CBSFAs, whether beach cleanups or monitoring or education and outreach, and just being at that place and taking care of that place. And I wish all that stewardship got as much of the attention as the rule package, because that stewardship's probably one of the most significant contributions to that place above the rule. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
Valid point. Okay, I guess as we go forward with our committee hearings, we will be hearing the bills regarding additional funding for FADs, and I think at that hearing, perhaps if you could help educate us about the FADs themselves, potential changes in design, because I know that's come up on a number of different conversations with different fishers about maybe we need a different kind of design of FADs. And so when we have hearings on it, you can fill us in on that. We'd be interested to hear. And then on the Ocean Stewardship Special Fund, you're looking to establish a ceiling. Have you come up with a dollar amount that you're looking at? We'd like to understand that better. And then the changes in increasing the ceiling for the Sports Fish Special Fund. I'd like to get details on that as well. And you can provide it to us offline, but we do need those details so we can work on the budget issues going forward. So I appreciate that. And thanks to the whole team. You are, you've got a lot of work ahead of you to implement all the rules, promulgate the rules for all the laws that we got passed last session. So you have your work cut out for you. So I appreciate your dedication to this. I feel that the resource is in good hands. So keep up your good work. Back to you, Vice Chair.
Thank you. Members, any further questions or discussion? Okay, if there's no further questions, this concludes our informational briefing. Thank you folks for this great information, and look forward to working with you folks throughout the legislative session. Mahalo.
Thank you. Appreciate it.